I'm sitting in my lawyer's office right now, watching my mother's face crumble as she reads the document that will change everything between us forever. The irony isn't lost on me. For 34 years, she chose my sister Rachel over me in every single situation that mattered, and now she's discovering that choices have consequences. Her hands are shaking as she flips through the pages of my will, searching desperately for her name, for Rachel's name, for any sign that I still consider them family. But they won't find what they're looking for, because I've finally learned something my mother never taught me, that love isn't supposed to be conditional, and family isn't supposed to make you feel like you're fighting for scraps of affection. The woman who raised me to believe I was never quite good enough is about to learn what it feels like to be the one left out in the cold. The meeting was supposed to be routine, just updating my will after my recent promotion to senior vice president at Morrison & Associates, the law firm where I've worked my way up from intern to one of the youngest partners in the company's history. My mother had been calling for weeks, ever since the announcement appeared in the Chicago Tribune's business section, suddenly very interested in my life after years of treating my career like an inconvenient hobby. She kept mentioning how proud she was, how she always knew I'd succeed, how important it was for families to stick together. It was laughable, really, considering she'd missed every graduation, every promotion celebration, every milestone that mattered to me because Rachel always seemed to have some crisis that required immediate maternal attention. But when she asked to be present for the will reading, claiming she wanted to understand my wishes better as my mother, I decided it was time she understood exactly where she stood in my life. The last straw had come just 3 months ago, during what should have been the happiest moment of my career. I'd been selected to give the keynote speech at the American Bar Association's annual conference, an honor that usually goes to lawyers with decades more experience than my 8 years in corporate law. I'd worked for months on that speech, and I'd specifically invited my mother because I thought, maybe this time, she'd choose to show up for me instead of for Rachel. I should have known better. 2 hours before my speech, as I was getting ready in my hotel room, my phone rang. It was my mother, and I could already hear the apologetic tone in her voice before she even started speaking. Rachel had decided that weekend would be perfect for redecorating her living room, and she needed help moving furniture. Not because she was injured, not because she had no one else to call, but because she wanted my mother there to validate her color choices and help her rearrange things for the 3rd time that month. The worst part wasn't even that my mother chose to skip my speech. It was the way she tried to make me feel guilty for being disappointed. She kept saying things like, "You know how Rachel gets when she's stressed about decorating, and you're so strong and independent. You don't really need me there, but Rachel does." It was the same pattern that had defined my entire childhood, the same excuse she'd used when she missed my high school graduation because Rachel had a mild stomach bug, the same logic she'd applied when she spent my college fund on Rachel's destination wedding to a man she divorced 18 months later. I'd spent 34 years being told I was the strong one, the independent one, the one who didn't need as much support, and I was finally beginning to understand that these weren't compliments. They were justifications for neglect. That night, alone in my hotel room after delivering my speech to a standing ovation that my mother would never witness, I made a decision that had been building for decades. I was done fighting for a place in my mother's heart that had apparently been reserved exclusively for Rachel since the day my sister was born 2 years after me. I was done pretending that being called low maintenance was somehow a badge of honor when what it really meant was that my needs would always come second. I was done accepting crumbs of attention and telling myself I should be grateful because at least I was getting something. The next morning, I called my lawyer and scheduled an appointment to revise my will, and for the first time in my adult life, I made decisions based on what I wanted rather than what would keep the peace in a family that had never prioritized my peace of mind. Looking back now, I can see that this moment was inevitable, that every choice my mother made, Every time she put Rachel's wants above my needs, every time she made me feel like I was asking for too much by simply wanting to matter, was leading us to this room where she's finally experiencing what I've felt my entire life, the devastating realization that you don't matter to the person who's supposed to love you most. The difference is, I spent 3 decades hoping things would change, believing that if I just achieved enough, accomplished enough, proved my worth enough, I might finally earn the unconditional love that Rachel had simply by existing. But my mother is about to learn that some distances can't be crossed, and some relationships can't be salvaged once trust has been broken too many times to count. The pattern started when I was 6 years old, though I didn't recognize it as a pattern until much later. Rachel had just turned 4, and she developed this habit of throwing spectacular tantrums whenever she didn't get exactly what she wanted, exactly when she wanted it. I remember one particular incident at Target when Rachel decided she absolutely had to have a pink sparkly unicorn that cost $45, money we didn't really have since my father had just been laid off from the steel plant. When my mother said no, Rachel threw herself on the floor in the toy aisle, screaming and kicking like someone was physically hurting her. Other shoppers were staring, and I could see the embarrassment burning in my mother's cheeks. I tried to help by offering to share my allowance money, suggesting we could come back another day, even trying to distract Rachel with a less expensive toy. But instead of appreciating my attempts to solve the problem, my mother snapped at me to stop making things worse and bought Rachel the unicorn to end the scene. That day, I learned a lesson that would shape the next 3 decades of my life. The person who makes the most noise gets the most attention, and the person who tries to make things easier gets taken for granted. Rachel learned a different lesson that day, that if she made enough fuss, eventually someone would give her what she wanted to make her stop. My mother learned that I would absorb her stress and frustration without fighting back, while Rachel would escalate until she got her way. It was a toxic dynamic that we all helped create, but I was the only one who suffered from it. From that day forward, whenever there was a conflict or crisis in our family, I became the one expected to be understanding, to compromise, to sacrifice what I wanted for the sake of keeping Rachel happy and my mother sane. The really insidious part was how my mother framed this dynamic as something positive about my character. She would tell relatives and family friends how mature I was, how responsible, how I never gave her any trouble like some children did. She made it sound like these were wonderful qualities, and for years I believed her. I thought being low maintenance was something to be proud of, that requiring less attention meant I was somehow superior to my dramatic, needy sister. It wasn't until I started therapy in my late 20s that I realized mature for your age is often code for forced to grow up too fast, and that children who never give any trouble are usually children who've learned that their needs don't matter. My therapist helped me understand that I hadn't been born naturally independent. I'd been trained to be independent because depending on my mother meant competing with Rachel, and I always lost those competitions. The financial disparities became impossible to ignore as we got older. When I was 16 and desperately wanted to go on the senior class trip to Washington, D.C., my mother explained that we simply couldn't afford the $300 it would cost. I understood. Money was tight, and I didn't want to burden the family. I took on extra babysitting jobs, worked weekends at the local grocery store, and managed to save up $250 by the deadline, just $50 short. When I asked if the family could possibly contribute the remaining $50, my mother said she'd try to make it work. 2 weeks later, Rachel came home with bags full of new clothes for the spring dance, clothes that easily cost more than my entire trip. When I pointed out the inconsistency, my mother got defensive, saying that Rachel's social life was important for her self-esteem, and besides, I was too mature to let something like a school trip affect my happiness. I ended up staying home while my classmates toured the nation's capital, watching Rachel get ready for her dance in outfits that cost more than my missed opportunity for education and memories. College was where the pattern became most destructive and most obvious. I'd worked throughout high school, maintained a 4.0 GPA, and earned a partial academic scholarship to Northwestern University. Even with the scholarship, I still needed help with living expenses and books. My parents had promised since middle school that they were putting money aside for my education, and I'd seen the bank statements that showed a college savings account with my name on it. But during the summer before my freshman year, Rachel decided she wanted to get married to her high school boyfriend, and she wanted a real wedding with all the traditional elements: the dress, the flowers, the reception at the country club. The wedding ended up costing $28,000, which was exactly the amount that had been saved for my college education. My mother sat me down the week before I was supposed to leave for Northwestern and explained that they'd had to borrow from my college fund for Rachel's wedding, but they'd pay it back as soon as they could manage it. That conversation was the first time I truly understood that I would always be expected to sacrifice my dreams for Rachel's wants. Not her needs, her wants. Rachel could have gotten married at the courthouse, could have had a simple celebration, could have waited until she and her boyfriend were financially stable enough to pay for their own wedding. Instead, she chose to have an expensive celebration that she couldn't afford, and my family chose to fund her choice with my future. I ended up taking out massive student loans, working 3 part-time jobs throughout college, and graduating with debt that took me 6 years to pay off. Rachel's marriage lasted exactly 18 months, ending when she decided she was too young to be tied down and wanted to find herself by moving to California to try acting. The country club reception, the designer dress, the professional photographer who captured her perfect day, none of it meant anything when she filed for divorce and moved across the country with a guy she'd met on Instagram. But even after Rachel's impulsive marriage fell apart, proving that her expensive wedding had been a waste of money that destroyed my educational opportunities, my mother never acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, she'd made the wrong choice. Instead, she focused on supporting Rachel through her divorce, helping her move to Los Angeles, sending her money when her acting career failed to materialize. When I graduated law school with honors and got my first job at Morrison & Associates, my mother's response was, "That's nice, honey," followed immediately by a 20-minute monologue about how worried she was about Rachel's financial situation and wondering if I might be able to help my sister out now that I had a good job. The idea that I might want to celebrate my achievement, that I might deserve recognition for overcoming the obstacles they'd placed in my path, that I might need some support as I started my career while drowning in student loan debt. None of that seemed to occur to her. The breaking point came last year when my grandmother passed away, and I discovered just how deep my mother's favoritism really ran. Grandma Eleanor had been the one person in my family who consistently treated Rachel and me equally, who remembered our birthdays with the same enthusiasm, who asked about our lives with genuine interest rather than obligation. She'd been battling cancer for 2 years, and I'd driven the 4 hours to Springfield every other weekend to spend time with her, help with doctor appointments, and just sit with her when the treatments made her too sick to do much else. Rachel visited maybe 3 times during those 2 years, always with some excuse about auditions or work or relationships that prevented her from making the trip more often. But when Grandma Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep, Rachel was suddenly very concerned about the funeral arrangements and very interested in being involved in settling the estate. The funeral itself was a preview of what was to come. Rachel showed up looking like she was attending a Hollywood premiere rather than saying goodbye to our grandmother, complete with designer black dress and professional makeup, talking loudly about how devastated she was and how Grandma Eleanor had been her absolute favorite person in the world. She monopolized the receiving line, giving dramatic performances of grief that made mourners uncomfortable, while I quietly handled the logistics nobody else wanted to deal with, coordinating with the funeral home, arranging flowers, making sure the church had everything they needed. During the service, Rachel sobbed loudly enough to distract from the pastor's eulogy, and afterwards, she held court at the reception, accepting condolences like she was the primary grieving party rather than one of several grandchildren who'd lost someone important. But Rachel's performance at the funeral was nothing compared to her behavior when we met with Grandma Eleanor's lawyer the following week. My grandmother had been a careful woman who'd saved money her entire life, living modestly so she could leave something meaningful to her family. Her estate was worth about $200,000. Not a fortune, but enough to make a real difference in someone's life. The will was straightforward: $50,000 to my mother, and the remaining $150,000 to be split equally between Rachel and me. It was fair, generous, and exactly what I would have expected from a woman who'd always treated us as equals. But the moment the lawyer finished reading the will, Rachel started crying. Not the performative tears she'd shed at the funeral, but angry, frustrated tears that came with demands for explanation. She couldn't understand why the split wasn't equal 3 ways between her, me, and our mother. She thought it was unfair that grandchildren received more than the daughter. She wondered aloud whether Grandma Eleanor had been mentally compromised when she'd made these decisions, suggesting that maybe the will should be contested. The lawyer patiently explained that the will had been updated just 6 months earlier, that Grandma Eleanor had been completely lucid and had specifically requested this distribution because she wanted to help her grandchildren build their futures. Rachel's response was to turn to my mother and demand that she do something about this obvious mistake. I watched in fascination and horror as my mother, who had just inherited $50,000 from her own mother, began nodding sympathetically at Rachel's complaints about the will being unfair. That's when I realized that my mother's favoritism wasn't just about emotional support or attention. It was about a fundamental belief that Rachel deserved more than me in every aspect of life, including our grandmother's final wishes. My mother actually suggested that I should consider sharing my inheritance with Rachel to make things fair, completely ignoring the fact that $75,000 each was already perfectly fair, and that our grandmother had specifically chosen this distribution for her own reasons. When I pointed out that the will was legal and final, and that I intended to respect our grandmother's wishes, Rachel accused me of being selfish and money-hungry. My mother supported her, saying I should think about how this looked to the rest of the family, how it might damage my relationship with my sister, how disappointed Grandma Eleanor would be if her final gift caused conflict between us. The conversation became surreal as I listened to my mother and sister argue that I should give up money our grandmother had specifically left to me in order to spare Rachel's feelings about not receiving more than she'd been given. They weren't asking Rachel to be grateful for $75,000 she'd done nothing to earn. They weren't suggesting that Rachel should accept our grandmother's decision with grace. Instead, they were pressuring me to sacrifice what I'd been given to make Rachel feel better about not getting everything she wanted. It was the exact same dynamic that had played out my entire life, just with higher stakes and legal documents involved. The woman who'd spent 2 years barely visiting our dying grandmother apparently deserved the same inheritance as the granddaughter who'd been there for every doctor's appointment and difficult conversation. That night, I made 2 phone calls that changed everything. The first was to the estate lawyer, confirming that the will was ironclad and that I had no legal obligation to share my inheritance with anyone. The second was to my own lawyer, asking him to draft a will that would ensure my assets would go to people who'd actually been there for me when it mattered. As I sat in my apartment, thinking about my grandmother's final gift and my family's immediate attempt to manipulate me into giving it away, I realized that this inheritance wasn't just money, it was a test. Grandma Eleanor had left me resources and independence, and my mother and sister were trying to convince me to give up that independence to maintain the same toxic dynamic that had defined our relationship for 34 years. For the first time in my life, I had something valuable that didn't depend on their approval, and they couldn't stand it. The final confrontation happened 3 weeks ago, and it started with a phone call that I should have seen coming. Rachel had been calling me almost daily since the inheritance situation, alternating between guilt trips about family loyalty and passive-aggressive comments about how my selfishness was tearing the family apart. But this call was different. This time, she was crying real tears, not the manipulative kind she'd perfected over the years, but genuine panic. She'd gotten herself into serious financial trouble in Los Angeles, owed money to people who weren't patient about collecting debts, and needed $30,000 immediately to avoid what she called serious consequences. She'd already asked my mother, who'd given her the last of her own inheritance money plus everything she could borrow against the house, but it wasn't enough. Rachel needed my help, she said, because I was the only family member who had access to that kind of money. The desperation in her voice was real, and for a moment, I felt the old familiar pull to rescue her from the consequences of her own choices. But then she said something that crystallized everything wrong with our family dynamic. "You know, Mom will never forgive you if something happens to me because you were too selfish to help." It wasn't a request. It was emotional blackmail with a threat attached. She wasn't asking me to help her because she valued our relationship or because she'd learned from her mistakes. She was demanding my money because she knew our mother would blame me if Rachel faced the consequences of her own poor decisions, and she was counting on my lifelong pattern of sacrificing myself to avoid my mother's disappointment. That's when I realized that even facing genuine danger, Rachel's first instinct was still to manipulate rather than to take responsibility. I told Rachel I wouldn't be giving her money, but I offered to help her find other solutions: legal aid, financial counseling, maybe even a loan with reasonable terms if she was willing to make real changes to her lifestyle. Her response was to scream at me over the phone, calling me heartless and selfish, saying I'd never cared about family and that she hoped I'd be happy when she ended up hurt because I was too greedy to help my own sister. Then she hung up and immediately called my mother, who called me within minutes, hysterical and furious. My mother accused me of abandoning Rachel in her time of need, of prioritizing money over family, of being cold and calculating just like my father's side of the family. She said she'd raised me better than this, that she was ashamed of the person I'd become, and that if something happened to Rachel, she'd never forgive me. That conversation lasted 47 minutes, and by the end of it, I felt something inside me break permanently. My mother wasn't calling because she was worried about Rachel's safety. She was calling because she couldn't stand the idea that I might not rescue Rachel from her own mistakes. She wasn't asking me to help my sister. She was demanding that I enable Rachel's irresponsible behavior by removing the consequences that might finally force her to change. When I tried to explain that giving Rachel money without requiring any accountability would only make her problems worse in the long run, my mother cut me off, saying I was making excuses and that real family members don't abandon each other over money. The irony was staggering. She was literally asking me to abandon my own financial security to enable Rachel's abandonment of personal responsibility. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I called my mother back and told her exactly what I thought about 34 years of being treated as the family's emotional support system while Rachel was treated as the family's most precious treasure. I told her about every missed graduation, every forgotten birthday, every sacrifice I'd made that went unacknowledged while Rachel's every whim was celebrated. I told her about the college fund that became Rachel's wedding budget, about the inheritance pressure, about the constant expectation that I should be grateful for scraps of attention while Rachel received unconditional support. I told her that I was done pretending this was normal, done accepting that loving my family meant accepting less than I deserved, done believing that being strong meant I didn't deserve protection too. My mother's response was everything I'd expected and everything I'd feared. She said I was being dramatic, that I was remembering things wrong, that every parent makes mistakes, but that doesn't mean they love their children any less. She said Rachel had always been more sensitive, more vulnerable, more in need of support, while I'd always been capable of handling things on my own. She said she'd done her best with both of us, and it wasn't fair for me to blame her for the choices Rachel had made as an adult. But then she said something that revealed everything. I've always been so proud of how independent you are, how you never needed me the way Rachel does. I thought that was a good thing. She still didn't understand that independence forced on a child isn't strength, it's abandonment with a prettier name. That's how we ended up in this lawyer's office today, with my mother staring at a will that reflects exactly how I've felt my entire life, like I don't matter to the people who are supposed to love me most. The will is comprehensive and final. My house, my investments, my life insurance, everything I've built will go to the organizations and people who've actually supported me. My law school mentor who encouraged me when my own family barely acknowledged my achievements. The women's shelter where I volunteer, which helps women escape from families that don't value them. The scholarship fund I've established for first-generation college students who don't have family money to fall back on. Even my elderly neighbor Mrs. Chin, who's shown me more maternal kindness in 3 years than my own mother showed me in 3 decades. As my mother sits there, reading about all the ways I've chosen to honor relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation, I can see her finally understanding what I've tried to tell her for years. She's experiencing what I felt every time she chose Rachel's wants over my needs, every time she asked me to be understanding while Rachel was allowed to be demanding, every time she made me feel like asking for equal treatment was asking for too much. The woman who taught me that love was conditional, that attention had to be earned, that my worth was determined by how little trouble I caused, is now learning that I've internalized those lessons completely. I've decided she's not worth the trouble, and I've chosen to give my love and resources to people who've proven they value me. My mother looks up from the documents, her eyes red with tears she rarely shed for my disappointments, and asks quietly, "How did we get here?" I want to tell her that we got here through 34 years of small choices, daily decisions to prioritize Rachel's comfort over my dignity, constant messages that my needs mattered less than family peace. We got here because she taught me that love was something you had to compete for, and I finally got tired of losing. We got here because she created a family where one daughter was precious and the other was durable, and the durable one eventually learned to protect herself. Instead, I just tell her what she told me so many times when I was disappointed. Sometimes life isn't fair, and we just have to accept it. The difference is, this time, I'm the one who gets to decide what's fair, and I've finally learned that I deserve better than the scraps of affection I've been accepting my whole life.